8. Patty Hearst. Patty Hearst enjoyed a privileged upbringing as the heiress to the Hearst publishing giant. One morning in 1974, she answered the front door of her Berkeley, California apartment and was kidnapped by members of a far-left organization called the Symbionese Liberation Army, considered a terrorist group by the FBI. The SLA's mission was to end capitalism and overthrow the U.S. government. Experts believe they abducted Patty because she was from a wealthy, powerful family, and it was an easy way to get the country's attention. They also saw it as an opportunity to demand a high ransom. Hearst spent weeks blindfolded and bound in a closet, and was only allowed out for meals at first. She eventually began sitting in on the group's political discussions, and they gave her propaganda to read when she was locked in the closet. Patty's role in the group expanded as she gained her captors' trust and became increasingly indoctrinated with their extreme views. 2 months after the kidnapping, she said in an audio recording that she was with the group voluntarily and had joined their fight against oppression. Just days later, she participated in a bank robbery. The following month, Patty exchanged gunfire with a sporting goods store manager and carjacked 2 drivers with another SLA member. Over the next year, she allegedly tried to kill 2 police officers with homemade bombs. After Patty's arrest in 1975, a court-appointed psychiatrist described her as zombie-like and said that her IQ had dropped significantly during her captivity. But in the eyes of the prosecution, she was a willing participant rather than a reluctant accomplice. She was convicted of robbery and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Less than 2 years later, then-President Jimmy Carter commuted Patty's sentence, and Bill Clinton officially pardoned her several years later. She denounced the SLA and published a memoir about her experience, and now lives a much calmer existence as a professional dog shower. 7. Lori Valedabel. Lori Vallow was still married to her 4th husband, Charles Vallow, when she fell under the spell of doomsday preacher and podcaster Chad Daybell. Charles filed for divorce in early 2019, citing Lori's increasingly bizarre religious views. He also claimed that she threatened to kill him if he interfered with her belief that she was a god who would do important work during Christ's second coming. A few months later, Lori's brother, Alex Cox, fatally shot Charles Vallow. Cox claimed he acted in self-defense, and authorities decided not to pursue further action. Lori abruptly moved to Rexburg, Idaho to be closer to Chad Daybell, who by then had become her lover. Tylee Ryan and her 7-year-old adopted son, JJ Vallow, vanished. Lori seemed strangely unconcerned about her kids, and instead of reporting them missing, she married Chad, whose wife had recently died under suspicious circumstances. In the meantime, investigators uncovered a mounting pile of evidence that Lori was involved in her kids' disappearance, including her belief that they were possessed and had become zombies. They found Tylee and JJ's remains buried on Chad Daybell's property in 2020. Lori and Chad face a laundry list of charges in connection with the child's deaths, as well as the deaths of Charles Vallow and Chad's wife. The case has been delayed numerous times due to issues surrounding Lori's competence to stand trial. The proceedings are slated to begin in April 2023, assuming there are no more delays. 6. Mariano Cuero. In 1996, a group of middle-class men led by 43-year-old businessman Gonzalo Higueras kidnapped 71-year-old Peruvian psychiatrist Mariano Cuero. Higueras, who lived next door to one of Cuero's adult children, was struggling financially. His plan was to collect ransom from Cuero and use it to catch up on his rent and his children's school tuition. During his 18 days in captivity, Cuero befriended his abductors. He persuaded them to let him listen to music, to bring him reading materials, and give him better food. At some point, Cuero's captors began watching TV and reading books together, including a story about a kidnapping similar to the one he was experiencing. The kidnappers even began taking advantage of Cuero's psychiatry skills and went to him for therapy sessions. As a result, Cuero began to feel sympathetic toward the men who were holding him against his will. He even counseled Higueras on the anxiety he was feeling about the abduction. After receiving a $150,000 ransom from Cuero's family, the kidnappers gave him some cab money and released him unharmed. Higueras had just enough time to use the money to catch up on his debts before authorities came and arrested him. In court, Cuero said that he feared for his life throughout the ordeal, but he nevertheless urged for reduced sentences for the suspects. In hindsight, he realized he experienced a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome, but pointed out that his captors seemed to also feel bonded to him. As strange as it seems, it worked to his advantage. Experts say that Cuero's ability to connect with his abductors most likely saved his life, and they pointed out that it was incredibly rare that he knew his kidnappers' identities, and yet they still let him go. 5. Heaven's Gate. Acting on an anonymous tip requesting a welfare check, a San Diego County deputy entered a large house in the affluent Rancho Santa Fe community in 1997 and was instantly overwhelmed by a putrid odor. He counted 10 dead men in the living room alone, each laying on his back with his face and torso covered by a square purple cloth. They were all wearing the same black sweatsuit and Nike sneakers. The body count continued to climb as more deputies arrived to investigate the scene. Altogether, they counted 39 deceased individuals, all ritualistically laid to rest in the same manner. They had all drank poison in what appeared to be a collective act of suicide. The individuals were members of a cult called Heaven's Gate. They would become immortal extraterrestrials and ascend to heaven aboard a UFO. They believed that attaining this state of being represented an evolutionary step forward, and that their human body was merely a container for their consciousness and soul. The cult leader, Marshall Applewhite, went by the alias Do and claimed he was directly related to Jesus. He influenced members to become as gender-neutral as possible. They all got the same haircut, gave up all their indulgences, and became almost childlike as they shed their individualism. Intimacy was strictly prohibited, and some male members of the group even got castrated to rid themselves of any urges. Their schedule was rigid, with some working to financially support the group, while others handed over their inheritances and life savings. Some experts argue that the tragedy at Heaven's Gate wasn't a collective act of people taking their own lives, but that it was a murder at Applewhite's hands. While he may not have physically forced anyone to follow through with the plan, group members were psychologically dependent on their leader and had seemingly lost the ability to think for themselves. And while some came to their senses and got out in time to spare their lives, others died needlessly for the deluded vision of a man who was most likely driven by a desire to manipulate rather than a true desire to help people. 4. The Knute B Murder. Until somewhat recently, the small Swedish town of Knute B was best known for its long-standing Pentecostal congregation, which was founded in 1921. After Asa Waldo took over as one of the church's leaders in 1992, she began brainwashing its parishioners, starting with claims that she was the Bride of Christ. Waldo ran the congregation alongside a pastor named Helge Fossmo, who was married to her sister, Alexandra. Fossmo was having multiple affairs, including with Asa Waldo, his live-in nanny, Sarah Svensson, and Annette Lind, the wife of a church member named Daniel Lind. One day in 2004, Alexandra Fossmo, Helga's wife, was shot inside the couple's home while Helga was allegedly asleep in another room. The shooter then went to the home of Daniel Lind, whose wife was sleeping with Helga Fossmo, and shot him. Lind survived, but Alexandra died from her injuries. The nanny, Sarah Svensson, admitted to being the shooter. She told police Fossmo persuaded her to commit the crime in order to get back in Jesus' good graces, which would thereby cast her in a favorable light to the so-called Bride of Christ. and his right-hand woman, Asa Waldo. Fosmo was ultimately convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, while Svensson was institutionalized. Questions still linger about the bizarre cult to this day, and the circumstances surrounding the murder remain somewhat shrouded in mystery. Many suspect that Asa Waldo, who was arguably the group's most manipulative and diabolical leader, was involved in Alexandra's death. Her murder was the end result of the years Waldo and Fosmo spent ruling the congregation through intimidation, greed, and sheer terror. The tragic case ultimately led to its collapse and left a seemingly permanent mark of shame on Knute B. 3. Helen Joy. In early 2021, police found the body of 54-year-old Helen Joy at her home in Wirral, England. The medical examiner counted more than 120 injuries, including brain bleeding and 14 broken ribs, and concluded that she died from a combination of being beaten and suffering from hypothermia. Helen's adult children immediately suspected her partner, Kevin Ashton, of foul play. They claimed to have witnessed Ashton's abuse against their mother firsthand, and accused him of brainwashing Helen against her own kids. Her daughter, Casey Hyland, would later recall how Helen stopped taking care of herself after she started dating Ashton. She became miserable and argumentative, started drinking heavily, and looked increasingly unhealthy. Neighbors corroborated the family's claims about the couple's heavy drinking and recalled overhearing frequent fights between them. Around the time of Helen's death, they overheard Ashton repeatedly yelling at someone to get up, but they didn't hear anyone respond. By then, Ashton had already been convicted of assaulting Helen several times. He was charged with murder and tried to make himself look like a loving boyfriend during the trial, claiming that Helen's deadly injuries were self-inflicted and from falling over drunk. But the jury was unconvinced and found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 19 years. 2. Invisible handcuffs. In 2013, 3 women quietly contacted social workers and said that they had been held against their will at a household in London for 30 years. They were rescued a week later and placed in protective housing, and authorities began the complicated job of figuring out exactly what happened. The women, aged 69, 57, and 30, described being under near constant supervision and subjected to cruel beatings at the hands of a couple they referred to as the heads of the family. They were enslaved as domestic workers and were almost never allowed to leave the house alone, yet somehow pulled off the appearance of a normal family well enough for neighbors to be oblivious to the situation. Authorities said they believed the youngest victim was born into captivity, and that she may have had little to no contact with the outside world throughout her entire life. They described the situation as the worst case of human trafficking they'd ever witnessed. Investigators acknowledged that not all of the abuse was physical, and that the women were bound by invisible handcuffs. In other words, they were also held psychologically captive. A police spokesperson revealed that they finally got the courage to reach out for help after watching a documentary about forced marriage. They were so deeply traumatized after their rescue that it took weeks for them to even start opening up to detectives. The 67-year-old married couple suspected of imprisoning the women were arrested. And while the outcome of the case is unclear, the survivors' newfound freedom marked the first step of what one can only imagine is a lifelong healing process. 1. The Sarah Lawrence Cult. When Larry Ray was released from prison in 2010, he crashed at the college dorm that his daughter Talia shared with her friends at Sarah Lawrence University just north of New York City. He became a sort of life coach, therapist, and father figure for Talia's housemates, but the nature of his relationships with the young co-eds soon became questionable. Parents who knew about the living arrangement complained, but nothing was done about it. After earning their trust, learning their darkest secrets, and slowly alienating them from their families, Ray began abusing the housemates physically and psychologically. He victimized at least 7 people over a 10-year period, subjecting them to torture and extracting false confessions from them for things they never did. He used the confessions and details from their past that they had opened up to him about to extort the victims for money, pocketing an estimated $1 million, and to force them to do unpaid work. Anytime one of the roommates denied one of Ray's false allegations, he subjected them to brutal hours-long interrogations. He also erupted into tirades over trivial things, like his food not being hot enough. Ray posted shocking allegations against his victims on a public website, where he uploaded footage of their incriminating false confessions. Investigative journalists Ezra Marcus and James D. Walsh exposed Ray's behavior in 2019, sparking a major law enforcement investigation. By then, he and several of his victims were living in Manhattan, where he was forcing one woman to work as a prostitute. Ray was ultimately convicted of trafficking, extortion, conspiracy, money laundering, and other crimes. He's scheduled to be sentenced in early 2023. Thanks for watching. Would you rather find out that someone you idolize was brainwashing and exploiting people behind closed doors, or find yourself caught in a tug-of-war with a suspected cult leader in your attempts to save a close friend from being brainwashed? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.